Once upon a time in midwinter, when the snowflakes were falling like feathers from heaven, a beautiful queen sat sewing at her window, which had a frame of black ebony wood. As she sewed, she looked up at the snow and pricked her finger with her needle. 3 drops of blood fell into the snow. The red on the white looked so beautiful that she thought, if only I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as this frame. Soon afterward, she had a small baby girl that was as white as snow, her cheeks were red as blood, and her hair as black as ebony wood, and therefore they called her Little Snow White. Unfortunately, soon after her child was born, the queen became very sick and passed away from her illness. After 1 year, the king got married again. Now the new queen was the most beautiful woman in all the land, and very proud of her beauty. She couldn't stand the thought that anybody could be more beautiful than she. The queen had a magic mirror in her room. She often stood in front of it every morning, staring at her own reflection and asking, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" And the mirror always said,
"You, my queen, are fairest of all."
And then she knew for certain that no one in the world was more beautiful than she, because the mirror always spoke the truth. Years passed, and little Snow White grew up from a baby into a lovely little girl. When she was 7 years old, she had red rosy cheeks, black ebony hair, and snow-white skin. She was even more beautiful than the queen herself. One day, when the queen asked her mirror again, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" the mirror answered,
"You, my queen, are fair, it is true. But little Snow White is 1,000 times fairer than you."
When the queen heard the mirror say this, she became pale with envy, and from that hour on, she hated Snow White. Whenever she looked at her, she thought that Snow White was to blame, that she was no longer the most beautiful woman in the world. This turned her heart around. Every day, having to look at the girl made her anger and jealousy grow stronger. With time, the queen's jealousy became so strong that she could not live in peace any longer. Finally, she called on one of her huntsmen to her room and said to him, "Take Snow White deep into the woods and kill her." The huntsman had to obey the queen's wish, so he took Snow White into the dark forest. When he took out his hunting knife to kill her, she began to cry and begged for mercy. "Please don't kill me," she begged. "If you have mercy on me, I'll run deep into the forest, and I promise that I will never return." The huntsman took pity on her because she was so innocent and beautiful, and he thought, "The wild animals will most likely eat the poor child anyway. I'm glad that I don't have to kill her." And he let her go. The young girl started to run into the big forest. Snow White was now all alone, and she didn't know where to go or what would happen to her. She was terrified. She ran over sharp stones and through thorns the entire day. She heard the wild animals in the bushes, but none of them attacked her. Just as the sun was about to set, her feet were so sore, her clothes were torn, and her arms were full of scratches and cuts. She couldn't go any further, and she noticed a little house close to the mountains. She came closer and knocked on the door, but nobody answered. She tried the door, it was open, and so she walked in. Everything in the house was so small, but neat and orderly. There was a little table with a white cloth on top, with 7 little plates, 7 little spoons, 7 little knives and forks, 7 little mugs, and against the wall there were 7 little beds, all freshly made. Snow White was very hungry and thirsty, but she didn't want to take anybody's dinner. So she ate a few vegetables and a little bread from each plate, and from each little glass she drank a drop of water. Because she was so tired, she wanted to lie down and go to sleep. She tried each of the 7 little beds, one after the other, but none of them felt right. Somehow, every single one seemed too long or too short, too hard or too soft. None of them felt comfortable until she came to the 7th one, and she lay down in it and fell asleep. The little house belonged to 7 dwarfs. They were working in a mine located close to the mountains. They spent every day there digging for gold. When night came, the 7 dwarfs returned home from work. They lit their 7 little candles and noticed someone had visited their house. The first dwarf said,
"Who has been sitting in my chair?"
The second one asked,
"Who has been eating from my plate?"
The third one exclaimed,
"Who has been eating my bread?"
The fourth one,
"Who has been eating my vegetables?"
The fifth one,
"Who has been sticking with my fork?"
The sixth one,
"Who has been cutting with my knife?"
The seventh one,
"Who has been drinking from my mug?"
Next, the dwarfs noticed that their beds weren't as neat as they were when they left in the morning. Then the first dwarf said, "Who stepped on my bed?" "And someone has been lying in my bed," said the second dwarf. And so forth until the 7th one, and when he looked at his bed, he found Snow White lying there in a deep sleep. "Look, someone is in my bed," he said. The 7 dwarfs all came running to look. They fetched their 7 candles and looked at Snow White. "Good heaven! Good heaven!" they cried. "She is so beautiful," they all said. Because they did not want to wake her up, they tiptoed away. When bedtime came, since the 7th dwarf didn't have his own bed, he had to sleep with his companions, 1 hour with each one, until the night was done. When Snow White woke up and saw 7 dwarfs, she was very afraid. But they were nice to her and asked her who she was and how she had found her way to their little house. "I'm Snow White," the girl said. "Who are you?" she asked. "My name is Smiley," said the first dwarf. "They call me Sleepy," said the second one. "I'm Grumpy," answered the third. "Call me Bashful," said the fourth dwarf. "They call me Dopey," said the 5th dwarf. "My name is Sneezy," said the 6th one. "And I'm the Doc," proudly said the oldest one and asked, "How in the world did you find our little house in the middle of the dark forest?" Then Snow White told them how her mother had tried to kill her, how the huntsman had spared her life, how she had run the entire day, finally coming to their house. After the dwarfs heard the story, they pitied her and said, "If you will keep house for us, and cook, sew, make beds, wash, and knit, and keep everything clean and orderly, then you can stay here with us, and you'll have everything that you want." Snow White was so happy, she agreed to stay with the dwarfs. After breakfast, the dwarfs left the house, but before they warned her. "We will be working all day in the mine, digging for gold," they said. "You are alone in the house. Remember, do not let anybody in. If your stepmother finds out you're alive, she might look for you here and try to hurt you." Snow White promised to take heed of their warning. Meanwhile, in the castle, the queen thought that she was again the most beautiful woman in the land. She believed that Snow White was dead and there was nobody on earth more beautiful than her, After a few days, she stood up in front of the magic mirror and asked her favorite question. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered once again,
"You, my queen, are fair, it is true. But little Snow White beyond the 7 mountains is 1,000 times fairer than you."
She couldn't believe her ears. It startled the queen to hear this because she knew that the mirror always spoke the truth. She knew that the huntsman had betrayed her. Because only the 7 dwarfs lived in the 7 mountains, she knew at once that they must have rescued her. She began to plan immediately how to kill Snow White, because she would have no peace until the mirror once again said she was the most beautiful woman in the land. But how could she do it? She knew that Snow White should not recognize her, so she decided to disguise herself to look as an old peddler woman who was going from house to house selling laces from her basket. She colored her face so that no one would recognize her and went to the dwarf's house. Snow White was very satisfied with her life. The dwarfs went every morning to work, and every night they returned home, Snow White had made food ready for them. She did their laundry and always kept the house clean and neat. Until one morning, when she was preparing dinner for the dwarfs and she heard a knock on the door. "Open up! Open up! I'm an old peddler woman with beautiful laces for sale." Snow White peered out the window. "What do you have?" "Bodice laces, dear child," said the old woman and held one up. It was braided from yellow, red, and blue silk. "Would you like this one?" "Oh, yes," said Snow White, thinking, "what bad could that poor woman ever do?" So she unbolted the door and let the old peddler in. "You are not laced up properly," said the old woman. "Come here, I'll do it better." Snow White stood before her, and she took hold of the laces and pulled them so tight Snow White could not breathe. And she fell down as if she were dead. Then the old woman was satisfied and left the house. Nightfall soon came, and the 7 dwarfs returned home. They were horrified to find their dear Snow White lying on the ground as if she were dead. They lifted her up and saw that she was laced up too tightly. They cut the bodice laces in 2, and then she could breathe and came back to life. "Must have been the queen who tried to kill you," said Doc. The dwarfs warned Snow White once again. "Take care, child, but remember, do not let anyone in the house again." As soon as the horrible stepmother got to the castle, she took off her costume and stepped in front of the magic mirror. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered once again,
"You, my queen, are fair, it is true. But little Snow White with the 7 dwarfs is 1,000 times fairer than you."
She was so horrified that the blood all ran to her heart, because she knew that Snow White had come back to life. Then for an entire day and night, she planned how she could get rid of her. Finally, she made a poisoned comb. Again, she disguised herself differently and walked through the dark forest. Until she got to the dwarf's little house. She knocked on the door, but Snow White called out, "I am not allowed to let anyone in." Then she pulled out the beautiful comb, saying, "Don't worry, I won't hurt you. Look at my amazing things, I'm sure you'll like them." She tempted Snow White holding the golden comb. Snow White saw how it glistened and didn't think. She opened the door and bought the comb from her. "Come, let me comb your beautiful black hair," said the old woman. She had barely stuck the comb into Snow White's hair before the girl fell down like she was dead. "That will keep you lying there forever," said the queen, and left. The dwarfs came home just in time. When they saw Snow White on the floor, they knew that the horrible queen was in the house. They pulled the poison comb from her hair. Snow White opened her eyes and came back to life and told them what had happened. She apologized for not following their directions and promised the dwarfs not to let anyone in the house again. The queen hurried back to her castle, feeling very happy because she believed that this time Snow White was dead. As soon as she got to the castle, she removed her disguise, stepped in front of the magic mirror, and asked the usual question. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered,
"You, my queen, are fair, it is true. But little Snow White with the 7 dwarfs is 1,000 times fairer than you."
When the queen heard this, she shook and trembled with anger. "Snow White will die," she screamed, "even if it costs me my life." Then she went into her most secret room, where no one else was allowed inside, and she made a beautiful apple. On one side she made it look green, while the other side was red and beautiful, and anyone who saw it would want it. Then she poisoned the apple's red side without touching the green. Then she disguised herself as a peasant woman, and this time filled her basket with apples. And for the 3rd time she traveled to the dwarf's house and knocked on the door. Snow White peeped out and said, "I'm not allowed to let anyone in. The dwarfs have forbidden it most severely." "If you don't want to, I can't force you," said the peasant woman. "I am selling these apples, and I will give you one to taste." "No, I can't accept anything. The dwarfs don't want me to," said Snow White. "If you are afraid, then I will cut the apple in 2 and eat half of it. Here, you eat the half with the beautiful red cheek," said the queen, passing her the poisoned part. When Snow White saw that the peasant woman was eating part of the apple, her desire for it grew stronger, so she finally let the woman hand the other half through the window. She bit into it, but she barely had the bite in her mouth when she fell to the ground dead. The queen laughed her terrible laugh and cackled, "This time no one can save you." And she hurried through the forest, muttering to herself, "Finally I succeed, and Snow White is dead." When she got back to the castle, she stepped in front of the mirror and asked with confidence, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" And the mirror answered,
"You, my queen, are fairest of all."
"Now I'll have some peace," said the satisfied queen, "because once again I'm the most beautiful woman in the land. Snow White will remain dead this time." That evening the dwarfs returned home from the mine and saw Snow White lying on the floor lifeless. They tried everything to bring her back to life. They loosened her laces and looked in her hair for something poisonous, but nothing helped. The dwarfs' hearts were broken. They laid her on a bed, and all 7 sat next to her and cried for 3 days and nights. After mourning for 3 days, they agreed to bury her, but they saw that she remained fresh. She did not look at all like a dead person, and she still had beautiful red cheeks. So they decided to make a glass coffin for her, and laid her inside so they could still look through the glass at beautiful Snow White. They wrote her name on the coffin in gold letters. "Here lies Snow White, the king's daughter," and placed the glass coffin in the front of their house, where one of them always stayed awake beside her, and kept watch over her body. They lit 7 little candles around the coffin so they could see her even at night. Snow White lay there in the coffin a long, long time, just like she was sleeping. Her skin was still as white as snow, cheeks as red as blood, and hair black as ebony wood. She lay there as if she were asleep. Many forest animals came to the coffin to look at the sleeping beauty. Though Snow White lay in the glass coffin for many years, she looked as if she was alive and only sleeping. One day, a young prince came to the dwarf's house and wanted shelter for the night. When he accidentally noticed Snow White lying there in a glass coffin, illuminated so beautifully by 7 little candles, he could not get enough of her beauty. He read the golden inscription and saw that she was the daughter of a king. He asked the dwarfs to sell him the coffin with the dead Snow White, but they would not do this for any amount of gold. But the prince continued begging, "I can't live without her. If you give her to me, I promise to take care of her, adore her, and honor her as my most cherished thing on earth for the rest of my life." After these words, the dwarfs took pity on him and gave him the coffin. When the prince's servants were carrying the coffin to his castle, they tripped over a big tree's roots. They suddenly dropped the coffin on the ground, and the princess got shaken so strongly that the terrible piece of apple she had bitten off came out of her throat, and Snow White came back to life. She opened her eyes and asked with surprise, "Where am I?" When the prince saw what just happened, his heart filled up with joy. He told Snow White what had happened and how he had fallen in love with her at first sight. And then he asked, "Would you marry me and live with me in my father's castle?" Snow White agreed to marry the young prince. Snow White said goodbye to the dwarfs who had been so friendly and taken care of her so well. Even though the dwarfs were so sad to lose Snow White, they were very pleased to know that she was alive and that she will be happy with the prince. Their wedding celebration was set for the next day. Everyone in the land was invited. Even Snow White's stepmother was invited as well. That morning, when she was getting ready to go to the wedding, she decided to wear her most beautiful clothes, and right before leaving, the queen stepped before the mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" And the mirror answered,
"You, my queen, are fair, it is true. But the young queen is 1,000 times fairer than you."
She was horrified to hear this, and so overtaken with fear that she could not say anything. Still, her jealousy drove her to go to the wedding and see the young queen. When she arrived at the party, the queen recognized Snow White. Her rage was so uncontrollable that she started yelling at the top of her lungs. The guards took her and threw her into the dungeon, where she stayed until the end of her days. Snow White and the prince had a beautiful wedding and lived happily ever after.
Why do birds suddenly appear every time you are near? Just like me, they long to be close to you. Why do stars fall down from the sky every time you walk by? Just like me, they long to be close to you. On the day that you were born, the angels got together and decided